Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Hi, everyone. Today, my guest is Stephanie Craig, president at Kith, a crisis management advisory firm. And we'll be continuing our conversation on being prepared so you can be crisis resilient. Welcome back, Stephanie.
Hi, Steve. It's so great to see you again. I'm thrilled to be back.
Yeah. So the last time we were talking about this whole crisis, I think you called it a life cycle, right? So remind the listeners what that is and how does that work?
So we're firm believers that crisis is not just something that pops out of nowhere. It's not, a ghost from somewhere behind a door and that scares you. You can see it coming. And so the crisis life cycle is very much something that if you were truly crisis resilient, you are already doing the full life cycle. So it depends. In our perspective, it starts with learn. The learning part, we'd rather you learn about where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are, who needs to do what, making sure you have the right people in place, the right systems in place before a crisis happens. So we prefer learning to start at the beginning.
Well, that certainly makes sense.
Right. And then through the learning, you learn to recognize what's coming at you. And that is part of what we talk about. We call it clarity plus trust equals speed. And speed is the magic ingredient to a fast, successful crisis response. And so learning to recognize what kind of crisis are going to befall your organization is a really critical part of becoming crisis resilient. Most people, for instance, if you have what we call it, let's just say an orange juice business, and somebody is saying, okay, you're going to get frost. The orange growers don't sit there, and the orange juice people do not sit there and say, well, we're just going to see how that turns out. They know that they recognize that a frost warning means the oranges are likely going to freeze, which means a lower crop, which means fewer oranges to create orange juice. So they start preparing. So that's the recognizing part of the crisis life cycle. And like I just said, recognizing it leads to proper mitigation. Understanding as an orange grower that you have to cover your orange trees to protect them for frost. That's a mitigation. If you are a large corporation where you have multiple stakeholders, mitigation looks a lot like making sure the people that matter to you, and you have to decide who that is. Some people it's customers, some people it's employees, some people it's shareholders. Understanding who that is and making sure they know who you are and what you stand for, that's another form of mitigation. And if you do the recognizing, the mitigation, the navigation, which is the next part, that's a much shorter timeline. There's a capacity to really to see it, to start to navigate it, and already prepare to recover from it. And that means that the crisis is less damaging to your business. The less time that you are off the rails from what you do best, from your day-to-day operations, the better. It is better for you as a leadership team, you as a business owner, the people that matter to you, and the ability to get back to business is the number one goal. So the shorter amount of time you spend in the navigation period, the better, because you're already focusing on recovering. And the recovery from a crisis is getting back to business, but then also doing a hard look at what went right, what went wrong, and learning again. And so the life cycle really is about knowing and learning from what you've done right, learning from what you've done wrong, and knowing what to do.
Yeah. So it sounds like to me, you started with learning, but you came back to learning, right? Because after
Absolutely.
you get through the mitigation, and you've got yourself back on the rails, then you want to learn again. So you're learning what to do next time. What did you do well? What did you do? What again? That whole again. It's a cycle.
Yeah,
And
really.
I think the other thing that as I think about this, the other place is, the crisis can be large or small. When we think about crises, we think about, the world falling apart. But this is anything that takes you off the rails to some extent.
Exactly.
Am I interpreting this correctly?
A crisis is different to everyone.
That's fair.
And you've hit it right on the nose, Steve. It's whatever knocks you off your game, whatever knocks you off the rails. Because if you are not doing business as usual, it's a crisis to you. And the smaller the business
Yeah.
is, the more impactful that is.
Well, and you could talk about it in terms of, a percentage of revenue that's knocked off, right? And if you're
Absolutely.
a tiny business, and you lose $50,000 a month, but your revenues are $60,000 a month, that's huge, right? If you're $500,000 a month, 50,000 still matters, but it's not the end of the world, right? If
Right.
you're $5 million a month and you lose 50,000, that's sort of fluctuations, right? So the level of impact and the amount of what constitutes a crisis
Right.
is different. But I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, is it's sort of anything that knocks you off your game, right? That takes you off of the sort of normal way that you do business. Uh,
Absolutely. And it's also there's the other part of this, which is part of the mitigation is minimizing the damage that your reputation takes.
so talk a little
Because
bit about that.
reputation, as Warren Buffett says, takes 20 years to make and seconds to lose. And making sure that your reputation remains intact is an investment. People, our founder likes to say, you own your brand, your customers, or your stakeholders own your reputation. What they think of you is what matters the most, and it is, if you lose their respect, if you lose their loyalty, it's very costly and very damaging to get it back.
So what are some of the things that you can do to, I'll say, prepare for, or, you know,
How do
yeah,
you kind of safeguard?
how do you say, yeah, how do you safeguard? That's the right word. How do you safeguard your reputation in that regard? As you're thinking about, preparation for a crisis.
So safeguarding a reputation for us is, it starts with understanding who your stakeholders are. I referenced this a little bit ago, but not everybody has everyone else as a stakeholder. As an organization, you really have to understand who matters most to you. And that can be some people, some organizations say you're an educational organization. And what type of educational organization? If you are a university, your students, your alumni, your parents, and your trustees matter. Does the local mayor matter? Maybe, maybe not. But they understand who matters to them. How do they fund their organizations? How do they fund their programs? is there state involvement? So then the state legislature becomes important to them. So as they're building their plans, they're investing in communicating to those organizations what the institution's values are. They're building trust with those stakeholders, so the stakeholders understand who that institution is. And so when somebody knocks them off their game, your stakeholders have your back, for lack of a better term. They're in your corner. And so nobody can sully your reputation in their eyes, because you have built trust with them. You've taken time to invest in that relationship. And when you invest in a relationship with a stakeholder, that means understanding what they care about, understanding where and how they communicate, really understanding who they are. And so as you continue through your operation, safeguarding a reputation comes from having people that know you, having people that trust you, and having people that are going to echo your reputation. You can't damage a reputation if the people that hold it continue to trust you.
Oh, that's a really good point. So the best way to safeguard your reputation is really to understand those key stakeholders and what matters to them in terms of your relationship with them. Is that a fair way to summarize that?
Absolutely. And I think something just kind of popped in my head. I was thinking of an example of a former client, and it's not either of the two people I'm going to mention. I should preface that by saying we prioritize discretion a lot in our business. But if you think about Starbucks versus Dunkin', Starbucks understands who their customers are and what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Dunkin' understands who their customers are and what they want. You don't see a lot of crossover in them trying to poach customers from one another, because they have different brands and they have different reputations. And so what they work on is cultivating their customers that are loyal to them. So they've created this loyalty based on who their customer base is, and talking to them in their language and meeting their needs.
Yes. Now that's yeah, and of course, understanding, that's one of the things that we talk about with all of our clients, right? Is who is that client avatar, right? And it's not just clients, but I think you correctly talk about stakeholders, right? So it's not just and this goes also to some of the nonprofit work that I do. Right? Because when we talk about in the nonprofit world, one of the challenges for a nonprofit is, you have people who give you money are different from the people to whom you provide service, right? In a for-profit business, they're usually the same people, right? And in a not-for-profit, so that's two sets of stakeholders for the nonprofit, right? Which makes their life a bit more complicated.
Well, and then I think you need to think it through in the world of, yes, you have two stakeholders, but then you need to weigh them. Is, okay, so here are the people that fund us. If we don't have them, can we still help them? So is there a different weight to your stakeholders?
Yes. That's an excellent point, right? And then of course the other piece of the stakeholders is always the team.
Yeah.
Right. It's always the employees or the team or however you want to talk about the people in your company, whether it's a for-profit or not for profit, they're clearly stakeholders as well. And in a crisis, of course, it would seem to me anyway, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, is what's the role of the team, and how do you prepare the team to respond and be resilient in that crisis?
Well, I think, just to one of your earlier points, I think we've seen in the last 18 months how important team is, and how important it is to keep good people in your organization. But to the point of building the resilience within your team, part of the learning isn't just evaluating. Part of the learning is really looking at your team, making sure the right people are in the right roles, making sure that they know what they're doing, make sure they know their roles, running them through crisis simulations, what we call tabletops. You would be amazed at once you start getting people to manage fictitious situations, how many unforeseen things come up. A lot of times we will do data breach and a lot of times ransomware. And ransomware has a lot of dynamics to it. One of them is your insurance. And to ask these companies if they have ransomware insurance, 90% of them look at you like a deer in headlights because they don't know. And they didn't even know that they needed to know. And so that learning isn't just looking back and trying to see what's coming at you. It's making sure you have the right people in the right roles. Some people are really, really great at positive public relations and never ever want to touch a crisis. So make sure that they're not in a really pivotal crisis role. You need to really look at your team and see if you have the right people on your team. Very few times have we ever done an active crisis without a lawyer. Almost all the time, the legal team is involved. And so I think that it is, it's imperative to look at your team and really understand if you have the right people on the team, as well are they in the right jobs, I think is a very important part. Additionally, I would take a hard look at your systems. Do the things like, do you have ransomware insurance? If you do, what does it say? Who is your first call if you have a ransomware attack? That kind of evaluation is critical to preparing. And so every time you do a workshop, every time you do a tabletop, every time you do a simulation, people become more comfortable with their roles and more comfortable in their role.
It's fascinating. Your concept of the tabletop and the sort of simulation game, if you will, around what are the kinds of things that can go wrong. So you talked a little bit about, cyber attack and ransomware. What are some of the other things that people should be thinking about? And I'm thinking here now, not just about, the very large corporations, but many of the listeners here are going to be in smaller companies where they don't have, they don't have a legal team. They don't have a, public relations team. There's a handful of employees. How should somebody like that go about doing this kind of, I'll call it a Gedanken experiment, right? Where they think about what could go wrong.
Well, it's very much, this is part of the recognizing and the mitigating and the seeing where you need to go, because then you can take a look at what you need on the table. So if you are, for instance, a small coffee chain, and something goes wrong. Today, I don't think I've had enough coffee because I'm very focused on it.
Clearly.
Is you need to know who your lawyer is. If you have a business, if you don't have a lawyer, you're paddling down a very dangerous set of rapids. Yes. But they don't have to be on your team, but know who they are. If you don't have a communications person on staff, find one that you can pay by the hour, but that does crisis as part of their repertoire. The other part of it is, if you are a small company, make sure that your crisis plans, that your crisis systems fit your company, because you may not need a lawyer. You may not need a communications person, but you very much may need a plant facilities person that's an expert at how to shut down a plant if something goes wrong. So understanding your business. So this comes part of the learning. Again, part of the learning. Understand your business. Understand what could go wrong, and make sure the people are sitting around the table that can prevent it from getting worse.
So are there then like categories of things that we should think about as we're thinking about what can go wrong for our business?
My number one thing that I tell people, regardless size of business, is you have to have people around the table that can make decisions or create a strategy. This is not when you are in the process of getting prepared for a crisis or in a crisis, it is not time for looky-loos. You're either a decision maker or an advisor. This is and making sure that all of the people that are on your team, and like I said, you will know your business. You will know who on your team can help you prevent a crisis from getting worse. So whoever that is should be around the table. And whatever that is, each of those people should be able to make a decision and give good advice. And then you should know their backup.
Ah,
Redundancy is one of
yeah,
the 15 things we preach, because God forbid somebody is, in Bali on vacation.
right.
Not really. I think we all wish we were in Bali on vacation. Uh, but
But when the crisis hits,
right.
you can't guarantee that everybody is going to be at the table,
Available. And
right?
then I think another aspect to this is it's a very large corporation, but it's a very good example. It's a global gaming company, and their head of their crisis posture is their general counsel. And so the general counsel, I think it's 3 times a year, brings together everybody involved in crisis and has a barbecue. Doesn't
Hmm.
do work, doesn't do anything else, has a barbecue. Why? So none of those people hesitate when they have to pick up the phone and call somebody on the team. Understanding who does what and understanding how to get comfortable with those people fast is another really important component of. But regardless of size of organization, because if something happens in a dairy producer, and early in the morning something goes wrong and the plant manager is asleep and you don't want to wake him up,
Hmm.
those are vital minutes that you've lost.
Right. You can't afford to hesitate. You need to
Absolutely.
be able to react. It depends on the scale of the crisis, of course,
Mhm,
right? As we talked earlier, right? Depending upon the level of crisis, that will determine how much reaction there needs to be. But
mhm.
you need to have the appropriate response, no matter the crisis, right? No matter the getting off the rails.
Well, and
So,
also it's this again to the learning. It's what we call smoke versus fire. There are a lot of things that look like fire that are just smoke.
hmm,
But if there's a
yeah,
fire, some case a real fire, you want to make sure that you know who to call and which
yeah,
decisions to make.
yeah. So speaking of learning, understand you have a course that you're developing on this and how that works.
Well, actually, we work with people to bring them through what we call a workshop, but we've decided to create more of um, a digital analysis that people can go through to gather their crisis readiness. And we have one both as a product, which is a kind of a much deeper dive analysis, but then we have a free scorecard on our website that just lets people to go through, answer some simple questions, and figure out their crisis readiness. And sometimes you don't need us. We are very specific, very, we get into your business type people. Sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes there are some really great books out there by a lot of really smart people. And maybe me in the near future, it's one of my goals for 2024 is to maybe put this crisis life cycle into a book. But there, you don't need us. But if you want to go to our website, it's kith.co. The co part is important. um, just take the quiz, figure out where your vulnerabilities are, figure out um, where your strengths are, because a lot of people have more strengths in responding to crisis than they think. And the vulnerabilities a lot of times are hidden. So if you have them illuminated for you, great. And then go off to your local. I'm a huge believer in small business and local business. So I would say go off to your local bookstore and find a great crisis book.
That's great. So is that the best way for people to start engaging with you, is to go to your website and take that quiz?
Absolutely. Plus, it's a little fun. BuzzFeed doesn't do as many quizzes as they used to, so come and take ours.
That sounds good. So that concludes our show for today. Thanks again to my guest, Stephanie Craig, who is the president at Kith, those crisis management advisors. I hope you learned something about how to manage your crisis and a crisis life cycle. I know I did. Thanks. And you've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.